Battle breaking versus turning. All right.
Ready when you are.
Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is walk through an ancient covenant ceremony. I'm going to kind of expound on our definition and unpack some of those things, not by talking technical terms right now, but rather hopefully by painting an image in your mind. You know, the old saying, a picture paints 1,000 words. I think that's true, particularly when it comes to covenant. I'm going to kind of walk through and just kind of create for you a story that probably happened thousands and thousands of times in the ancient world, cross-culturally. We know that in the ancient world, covenant was a very widely known and practiced reality. You could sort of think of it as the social glue that held communities together in the ancient world. If we were in the ancient world right now, we could sort of skip this part of the conversation because everyone just kind of knew about this stuff through most places and times. But since we don't see much of covenant in our world anymore, it's helpful to describe an ancient covenant ceremony and then think, what was it saying? What did the pieces represent? What does the symbolism tell us about the nature of covenant? Now, of course, in the ancient world, there were lots of covenants, different kinds, right? Friendship covenants, marriage covenants, covenants between tribes that, let's say, had been having friction or war, and at some point decide to solve the problem of aggression and bring peace, what we'd call a peace treaty. I mean, our contemporary peace treaties are simply modern-day examples of ancient covenants that brought people back into a state of peacefulness after tension and war had torn their relationships apart. So lots of different types of covenants in the ancient world. Let's imagine this particular situation is one where two people groups have been at war with each other. There's been some kind of tension. It's brought bloodshed on both sides, frequent in the ancient world because of their sense of community being so strong. If someone from one community harmed another, something called a blood feud would break out. This is something that was even part of early American culture. You think of the Hatfields and the McCoys, that ongoing friction amongst those families was an example of a blood feud. People became enemies just because that family harmed a member of my family, right? So this is a common problem in the ancient world, and how to solve it was usually answered by covenant. So let's say two people groups have been at war, and finally they agree. It's time for peace. Probably at one point, one of them sent a delegate to the chieftain of the other people group and said, "We are offering peace. Will you join us?" And let's say this person sends an affirmative response back. Yes, let's enter covenant and finally bring peace to this tragic war. What that will mean is a place, a site, a piece of land will be designated as the place where the covenant will happen. One of the tribes or people groups will host this, let's say. And let's say it's a nice sunny Saturday morning, and the one tribe hosting is waiting, the space prepared for the other. As the other group gets there, there's a semicircle already waiting, and the other group forms the rest of the circle. It's kind of forming the arena in which covenant will happen this day. Into the center of the circle will probably walk the two major representatives of the two tribes, the chieftain or the chief patriarch or whatever it is in that particular culture. The two main representatives will come, and they will do much of the covenant making that day. But because this is a community-based culture in the ancient world, every person in that circle knows that what their covenant representative is doing, they are doing too. Because in a sense, they are in their covenant representative. This will be important language for us later when we realize Jesus is our covenant representative and we are in Christ, in Jesus. That's what the language Paul's using all throughout his letters means, that we are covenantally in Jesus. So what Jesus does for covenant, he does for us. So what the two representatives do, they do for their people. Perhaps the first thing that will happen as these two are in the center of the circle, about to enact covenant, is maybe a young person comes into the center of the circle with a tether. At the other end of the tether is some kind of animal, a sheep, a goat, maybe a smaller calf. This animal will be taken, and by the two representatives will be literally hacked in two. Probably a large machete or sword comes out, and the animal is split in two. Of course, as that happens, blood squirting and soaking them and soaking the ground around them. See, blood's an important part of covenant, and it starts right there with this first blood sacrifice. And as the animal splits in two, they're going to take the two pieces of the animal and lay them opposite each other, symmetrically. And in between will be just enough room for them to stand together. This will be sort of the immediate altar of the covenant relationship. It starts with death. Now what's going to happen is these two partners will link arms. Perhaps is a little bit different in each culture, but they're going to be walking in some fashion between or around or through these pieces. Some call this the walk of death. What it means, even though nothing is being said verbally, as they walk together through the pieces of these animals, they are non-verbally saying, let it be done to us what was done to this animal if either us or any of our people break this covenant. Covenant is life or death. It's that serious. So the animal represents what happens to covenant breakers. What we'll notice in the ceremony is there'll be a lot of graphic symbolism, much of it reminding on into the future these covenant partners what they've done, the importance of what they've done, and the fact that remembering is absolutely essential. To forget is possibly to invite your own death by breaking covenant. Covenant partners must remember the covenant. Once the walk of death happens, and the two parties now coming and standing before each other again, now the witnesses are called. Calling on the witnesses. This will be both divine witnesses as well as the human witnesses that surround them this day. Now, if they're ancient Jews, this part of the ceremony is pretty simple and straightforward. They'll simply say, Yahweh God, witness today this covenant. But if they're from a polytheistic culture, this might be a longer part of the ceremony. It could go on quite a while as they start to name many ancestors and gods and nature deities and spirits. Because see, every divine witness, every spiritual being that is named is pulled into the covenant. If the covenant is broken, now that spirit being is offended and bring curses upon the covenant breaker. And if the covenant is kept, these spirit beings are part of that too, and they bring blessing to the covenant keepers. So having God, or if they're polytheists, the gods involved is very important to this covenant relationship. The human witnesses are called too. The spectators are not spectators. Here's the thing, you can never be a spectator, just a spectator at a covenant ceremony. At the very least, you are participating as a witness. You saw what happened, and so you are part of holding that covenant together. The human witnesses are called to attention because they will serve as the community that lives out this covenant, encouraging each other, challenging each other, always to press into covenant keeping and to avoid covenant breaking. Once the witnesses are called, now the terms are given. The terms or the stipulations of the covenant are just, what is it we're promising to? What are we saying here? It might be as simple for this group as something along these lines. From this day forward, we will not conduct war. Not against each other. Never again. From this day forward, we will be brothers and sisters in peace. From this day forward, we'll share resources. Perhaps they'll say that from this day forward, there might even be intermarriage, almost as if it's like it's become one big people group. Perhaps they'll promise that if any outside forces attack one of them, the other will come to their aid, because they are now covenant brothers and sisters, and they will protect and die for each other. Once the terms of the covenant are spoken, then the blessings and the curses are spoken as well. Blessings, that's what happens if covenant is kept. Perhaps things like they'll just name the fact of protection as they have each other's backs, of sharing of resources, of life. It turns out that the blessings of life are associated with keeping this covenant. Then the curses are spoken. Curses, just the clear and disastrous effects of what happens if this covenant is broken. It means someone dies, for sure, whoever the immediate covenant breaker is, but it also threatens the peace of this new community. It might be pushing this back into a blood feud. It might mean war and vengeance and all the things that come with breaking covenant relationship. So they want to be very clear. Keeping covenant is life. Breaking covenant is death. And the curses and the blessings make that very, very clear. Now, the shortest part of the ceremony is about to happen. Shortest, but the most important. It's just a couple of words, usually. It's the promise. We sometimes call this the oath or the vow. It's sometimes signaled by phrases like yes, or I do, or I will. But what it is the two parties just verbally agreeing and promising to everything that's just been said. In other words, at the heart of covenant is promise. Somehow our words create the reality of a new family relationship. This shouldn't surprise us. God created the whole world, the universe, just by speaking. Right? Genesis chapter 1, verses 3 and following, God just says, let there be something, and it happens. In other words, words have power. And our words, because we're created in the image of God, also have power. Power to create things like covenant relationships. So as the two parties speak promises, covenant literally happens right there. What were formerly two people group at war now become a single covenantal family. Once the promise is made, the oath or the vow, now some things will happen in the ceremony that will give symbolic weight to what's just happened. See, the promise did create something. A new thing has arisen, a living relationship that was not there a minute ago is now there. But it's a spiritual thing. People can't see relationships with their eyes. While God can, we can't. And so now the parties are going to do things in the physical world that help them remember and picture clearly what's just happened in the spiritual realm, the actual promised covenant. Some cultures, the two members, the two covenant representatives, will take a dagger out of their sheath and slice their palm open. Let the blood trickle down the forearms, bring the two palms together and clasping in what we know as the ancient blood brothers ceremony. Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn did this in Mark Twain's book when they cut their fingers as made a friendship covenant. This goes back centuries into the past, where the blood brothers ceremony is a well-known way of saying we used to be two, but now we are literally one blood relative. See, it's a way of symbolizing the fact that even though we come from different mothers, it's as if the same blood from the same mother ran in our vein now because we have exchanged blood. We are blood brothers. In some cultures, it's actually said that they would then reach down into the dirt or gravel and kind of rub it into the wound to really to mess up the side, the edges of the incision, so that when it heals, it doesn't heal over nicely and disappear, but rather it leaves a thick, visible scar there. This was a visible, ongoing reminder to them of the covenant they had made. For the rest of their life, that scar will remind them, I am a blood brother. Cannot forget that. My life's literally on the line here. Once this blood and scarring ritual happens, now there'll be some exchange of something. Different cultures did this in different ways. Some would exchange a gift. Some would actually exchange their names. Others would exchange armor, weaponry. This is what happened with David and Jonathan when they made a friendship covenant. It says in that passage that they gave each other their swords. The idea being that when you exchange swords with a man, you must protect that man with his sword. Never use it against him, but always for him, and vice versa. It's mutual protection now. In some cultures, it's said they would actually strip naked right there and exchange clothing. Stuff, whatever is being done is saying this. I've become you, and you've become me. We've become an us. There's a new covenant relationship here. Once the exchange of gifts or what have you has happened, now often things turn festive. Things have been very serious, a lot of blood involved, getting very clear on the importance of the life and death nature of covenant. But now it's time to celebrate this new relationship. A sacrifice to God, or the gods if they're polytheists, is made, thanking them for being part. Or if it's a Jewish person, thanking Yahweh for being a witness to this covenant. And then the covenant feast happens. Every covenant has to incorporate a feast, a time when parties who were not two, or who were two, weren't one, now sit together as one, as a single family unit, sharing a meal. Remember in the ancient world, meals, you only ate with people that were your peers. You only ate with people that you saw as your social equals. And so to eat together for the first time with people who had been your enemies is a profound statement of unity and connection and trust. Before they leave that day, two more things will happen. The sign of the covenant will be expressed. Now, there's been a lot of signs or symbols, you could say, but there's going to be one particular sign. Most covenants had a unique sign that was shared by the group or by the partners, and that they know represented in a very special way the reality of the covenant that no one can see with their eyes. But this sign sort of gave it visible, physical, ongoing visibility. It was something you had to be able to see or experience. So the sign is something in the physical realm that represents the reality of the spiritual covenant that's been made. In some cultures, they might plant a tree right where the animal has been sacrificed, right where this covenant has happened, representing that as the tree grows through the years, so their relationship will grow in stability and sturdiness and health. Some, and this happens a lot in the Old Testament, some cultures just put a big pile of rocks there, memorial stones. Years later, while this animal carcass is long gone and decomposed, this pile of rocks, right where that animal was slaughtered, will remind them where the covenant happened and represent the stability, the solidness of their relationship. And finally, before they leave, they'll probably make a promise about meeting in the same place about 1 year from now and having a covenant renewal ceremony, an ongoing annual remembrance, celebration, renewal time to come together, to celebrate, to eat, and to keep fresh this covenantal relationship. Now, what I just described there are 11 elements of an ancient covenant ceremony. Not every covenant ceremony had all the 11 elements. This is sort of an ideal, typical covenant ceremony to get just the ideas of sorts of things that were done in the ancient world. But some covenants have some of these. Every covenant had a couple of these elements. If there was no promise, if there was no witnesses, there just wasn't a covenant. So at the heart of all this is a community, at least two parties, before God, who are promising to clear terms that's going to bind them in a covenantal family-like relationship. If you would, if you're watching this with others, or maybe just reflecting on your own here with this series, it'd be good to stop for a minute and just think about those 11 elements. Do we have any of those left in our culture today? Have you ever seen any of those 11 elements played out in some kind of a ceremony? Where is covenant in our culture today? Take a moment to think about that. So as you thought about these 11 elements, I'm guessing that for many of us, as we are reflecting on where we might see these in our culture, the most common answer that we come up with is, well, a lot of that sounds like the traditional wedding ceremony. And it does. Really, the traditional wedding ceremony is one of the last places that we see a lot of ancient covenant symbolism happening in our culture today. Some people will say, well, we see that stuff in legal contracts, and we do see some of that for sure. Terms and witnesses and consequences. But the place that most of us kind of hone in on when we think about where do we see covenant happening today is the traditional wedding ceremony. It's interesting to think about. Which of those 11 elements do we see in the traditional wedding ceremony? Which don't we see? Obviously, you're probably not going to walk into a wedding these days and see any animals being slaughtered. Probably not going to hear about any curses that are being expressed. A lot of blessings are said, but not many curses. There's some parts that we just don't see any longer. From a Christian perspective, I actually think that's good. We have to remember that in the Christian context, we do not slaughter animals anymore to remind ourselves that one of us will die if we break covenant. As the Apostle Paul reminds us, Jesus is our lamb, our slaughtered lamb. One death, Hebrews says, covers all. So Jesus has literally become what used to be the slaughtered animal. Now it's the Son of God who's taken our covenant-breaking death on himself. This is really an important thing to remember. Not only do we not kill animals to remind ourselves that covenant-breaking brings death to our partner, rather, we remember that because Jesus is our sacrificial lamb, we do not require the death. We do not require vengeance from our enemies. All that we are called to do is, as Jesus gave us mercy, so we give our covenant partners mercy when they break covenant with us. It's mercy, not judgment, that triumphs in the kingdom of God. This says a lot about what it looks like to be in covenant together in churches, in friendships, in marriage, that when conflict happens, when covenants are broken, our response as kingdom people is always to come with forgiveness, mercy, and attempts to heal. Not all relationships can be healed, that takes two. But our heart as kingdom people is to always lead with mercy and forgiveness and an openness to God restoring. Now, other parts of those 11 elements we do see in the traditional Christian wedding ceremony. We certainly see witnesses, right? Though sometimes we forget that the whole reason for having groomsmen and bridesmaids, the best man and the maid of honor, that comes from ancient witnesses. And so to do this well, to do it wisely, wouldn't just be asking who looks good in a tuxedo or a dress, but ask the question, who do I suspect is going to be in my life for the long haul, whose character I trust, whose faithfulness I can count on, and who will walk with this marriage. See, marriage, it's never about just two. It's about a community. Every marriage needs a community to walk with it in support, in encouragement, and in challenge when necessary. To remind us that, yeah, we really did say those promises, but hey, that there's a community that can help us through those difficult stretches. Witnesses, absolutely essential. The giving of terms. The vows we either write or borrow from the traditional wedding terms, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and health, until death do us part. Powerful promises. And then there's the vow, the oath, the I do. It's a centerpiece of the whole ceremony, right? You could have all the hoopla and all the flowers and dresses and tuxes and guests, but if it comes to that moment in the ceremony and the people are asked, do you take? And the answer is, can I think about it for a week? Nothing happens. Covenant requires that promise, that mutual promise of I do, I promise, we vow. We've sort of cleaned the mixing of blood and scarring up. Not a lot of slicing of palms and blood brother-sister relationships and ceremonies, but notice what we do still do. We've just found ways of doing it in different, cleaner methods, right? Whether it's lighting a unity candle, or whether it's, I've been at one wedding where a couple mixes different colors of sand into a container that you really can't pick them apart. Things that we do to show that the two have become one, and you really can't undo that. Exchange. We still exchange gifts. Right? At my wedding, some years ago, Kelly and I exchanged rings, a visible reminder of our promises to each other. Exchanging of names frequently happens at weddings. Don't do a lot of exchanging of clothing or armor anymore, and that's probably a good thing. The names and the gifts keep it alive, though. I've become you, part of you, you've become part of me, we've become an us. Marriage brings that one flesh relationship. Not a lot of animal sacrifices today, but certainly still have the covenant feasts. The wedding reception is just what's left from the ancient covenant feast, where two parties, two families in this case, who were not united, are now literally brought together in this new family unit of this marriage. What about the sign of the marriage covenant? It's interesting. When you read through the lens of covenant, the biblical teachings on marriage and weddings, it becomes pretty clear that the sign of the covenant, the sign of the marriage covenant, is sexual union. Once this dawned on me some years ago as I was studying this topic, it began to answer a lot of questions about why and how God approaches sex the way he does in the Bible. It's never, at least for human beings, it's never just about a physical activity. It is literally about signing a marriage covenant. See, this is why God always includes sexuality within the context of marriage. It's because what sexuality is, what sexual union is signing, physically enacting what it is we verbally promise to each other in the public ceremony. So, what's a wedding? At its most basic, a wedding is a public vow in front of witnesses and a private signing ceremony between the couple themselves. It's a sign of what was done in the public ceremony. This is why literally sex outside of marriage isn't just not wise from a biblical moral standpoint, it's not wise from a logical standpoint. Because to sign something that you haven't actually verbalized, well, that's sort of like signing a check. Again, signing check language comes from ancient covenants. It's my signature's promising there's money in this account. So signing sexually with our bodies without having a marriage covenant to be signing is sort of like signing a check and giving it to someone. They're trusting there's money in your account, but you don't actually have an account, or there's no money in there. We'd call that fraud, not speaking truth. Same thing if we're signing bodies without the verbal promises. Makes a lot of sense out of God's teachings of sexuality in Scripture. And finally, of course, there is the annual renewal ceremony, what we call our anniversaries. Might be a wise idea to make it more than dinner and a movie, to remember that it actually is an ongoing renewal of the covenant, to celebrate that, to talk about it, to make sure things are still alive and fresh and healthy. So you see that there is at least one place left in our culture, the traditional wedding ceremony, where a lot of this still happens. It's just for the most part, we don't know why we do this stuff. Probably for most people who do a traditional wedding ceremony, if you ask them why, they'll simply say, well, that's what you do to get married. Yeah, of course it is. But each of those pieces have a deep covenantal meaning to it. And for us to remember that as kingdom people helps to put a fresh, deep covenantal depth into our marriage relationships. Last thing we'll do in this session is talk about a couple of types of covenants that will help us as we move through our sessions together, particularly the next session as we come to Scripture and start looking at the 6 major covenants that God has enacted with human beings. We'll notice that Some of God's covenants are different, depending on what God's wanting to do in those covenants. And to be able to understand them well, we have to have some categories to work with. A couple of different types of covenants and how we can make sense, better sense out of the Bible. The first category answers this question: who has the power to define and to design the covenant? Who has the power to define and design the covenant? Now, there's two types of covenants with regard to this question. One type is called unilateral, one type is called bilateral. In a unilateral covenant, one person, one party, has more power in the relationship. You'd call them, in some sense, the more superior partner in terms of authority or ability to implement the nature of this covenant. Think perhaps, think of the best example of this, which is when God enters into covenant with us. God is always the more powerful party. He's the creator, we're just creatures. It's not a bad thing, it's just naming what's true. And so, in every one of God's covenants, those covenants are unilateral, meaning that one party has the authority to both define and design the covenant. All of God's covenants are unilateral. He doesn't come to us and sort of negotiate with us or ask us to sort of create half the covenant. He designs the covenant and then offers it to us. Now, we still have the choice of entering or not. He never forces covenant, but his covenants are unilaterally designed and defined and then offered to us as his covenant partners. Other sort of covenantal relationships like that would be, say, something like the covenantal relationship that, say, a nation makes with its citizens. It's the government or the leaders who get to sort of name, this often being more contractual than covenantal, name the laws, and the citizens simply agree either to be a citizen of that country and participate, or they leave. But they can't get in and tell the government that they're going to enact different laws. There's a governmental process for that, right? Or you think of adoption, another covenantal relationship where parents bring a non-biological youngster into their family. That's a pretty unilateral relationship. When you bring an infant in, the infant doesn't have a lot to say about that relationship, but they are being loved and embraced. It's just a unilateral covenant. So one type is unilateral. Bilateral is the other type. Bilateral covenants are those where both parties have roughly equal power, and therefore there's mutual design and definition and together creating this covenant. I think marriage is it should be a good example of this, where there's equality between the partners, and they talk together about what will our marriage look like? What will it mean? What does love look like for us as a couple? A friendship covenant would be another example of a bilateral covenant where two friends sit down together and sort of talk together about what their covenant will look like. So, always this question: who has the power to design and implement the covenant? Either unilateral, one party, or bilateral, both parties negotiating together. Another question that raises the fact of different types of covenants is this: if someone breaks the covenant, what happens, and can this covenant be terminated? That's an interesting question. So there's a difference in covenants between breaking and terminating a covenant. Breaking a covenant just means that one of the terms of the covenant has been violated by somebody. Now, if the covenant's been broken, that means there's been damage to the relationship. That doesn't necessarily mean that the covenant is terminated. It might mean that, but it doesn't have to mean that. This gets us to another difference of two types of covenants: conditional and unconditional. Okay? In an unconditional covenant, the parties both promise that whether the partner breaks it or not, they will always be faithful to the covenant. It's an unconditional covenant. There's no condition, including breaking it, that can end that covenant. It's really important to know if one is entering into an unconditional or a conditional covenant. In a conditional covenant, there are conditions that if they happen, that covenant can be terminated, as in it is no longer. We're going to see, as we move through the scriptures and God's covenants, that sometimes God makes conditional covenants, sometimes he makes unconditional covenants. And he's very wise about which he does when. I'd propose that we have to follow God in wisdom here. We have to know, every time we go into a covenant, are we entering it conditionally or unconditionally? If it's broken, what's the appropriate response? Mercy and forgiveness? Or can the relationship actually come to an end? These are all covenantal questions that have to do with different kinds of covenants. This is often in our culture, because we're not clear about covenants, often we're not clear when a terminated covenant happens, or should it happen, or does breaking mean termination, or should we forgive? These are the things that practically we'll be getting into as we walk through human covenants in all their various types and styles, and what God calls his kingdom people to do in these various relationships. Some kind of more